Hello, I'm Ava Kuredjian. I'm WPR's music producer, and I am joined today by Martin Goldsmith. He was the former host of NPR's Performance Today and is currently heard on weekends on Sirius XM. We're going to be talking a little bit about his memoir, The Inextinguishable Symphony, and its film adaptation, which is called Winter Journey, and that's going to be screened in Milwaukee on January 9th. I'm losing an earbud. How are you today, Martin?
I'm doing well, Ava. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so excited. Do you want to maybe start by giving a little summary of the story in your film and book?
Sure. The On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. He and his Nazi cohorts had many things on their plate, many things they hoped to accomplish. One of the first things they did was to evict Jews from their positions with German opera companies, theater companies, and orchestras. And in the late spring, early summer of 1933, some of those now unemployed Jewish artists came together to form something called the Jüdische Kulturbund, the Jewish Cultural Association, reasoning that if they could no longer make art for their fellow Germans, they could make art for their fellow German Jews. And they put together a theater company, an opera company, an orchestra, starting on October 1st of 1933 with a play called Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise, by Gotthold Lessing. They put on plays, they staged fully realized operas, they gave orchestra concerts, uh, chamber music concerts, all for the Jews of Germany. To be a participant with the Kulturbund, you had to be Jewish. To attend a Kulturbund performance, you had to be Jewish. It was very much a closed society. And it was not only allowed, but encouraged by the Nazis. Joseph Goebbels, the minister of propaganda for the Nazi regime, reasoned that if anyone raised any kind of an objection to the news of the way Jews were being treated in Germany, Goebbels could just shrug and say, well, look, they've got their own orchestra, their own opera company. How badly can they really be treated if they have all of these wonderful cultural opportunities? So the Kulturbund operated with the full cooperation and encouragement of the Nazis, and they put on some very fine productions. The first time that Verdi's opera Nabucco was ever staged in Germany, it was a Kulturbund production. The play Six Characters in Search of an Author by Luigi Pirandello was first performed in Germany as a Kulturbund production. So this was very much a first-rate organization with some of the very finest musicians and actors and dancers who had formerly been employed by German companies. My mother joined the Kulturbund in Frankfurt in the autumn of 1935, and shortly thereafter, the Nuremberg laws were passed, which stripped the Jews of Germany of any of their civil rights and did lots of other nasty things in addition. My father, who was then 22 years old, studying in Karlsruhe, studying the flute in Karlsruhe, decided that he'd had enough of life in Germany and was about to emigrate to Sweden. But he managed to accept an offer to play a couple of concerts with the Kulturbund Orchestra in Frankfurt because the regular flutist had gotten sick. And when that same flutist who had gotten sick in the autumn of 1935 emigrated to Palestine in March of 1936, my father decided to leave the relative comfort of Sweden and move back to Germany, to Nazi Germany, to be with the woman who would later become his wife and my mother. So the first book, Inextinguishable Symphony, recounts their adventures and their last-minute escape from Germany in June of 1941. So that's the story of the book. And then sometime after the book was published, I got an email from Anders Ostergaard, a Danish filmmaker, who wanted to make a film based on the book. And I was very pleased at the prospect, as you might imagine. Even more pleased when Anders managed to get under contract the wonderful Swiss-born actor Bruno Ganz, known primarily for his performance of Adolf Hitler in the movie Downfall, and earlier starring as an angel in the movie Wings of Desire by Wim Wenders. He, Bruno Ganz, plays my father in the film, in which I am a constant presence, but never on screen. The conceit of the film is that I'm interviewing my father to find out more about his life and my mother's life as musicians in Nazi Germany. So that's the story of the book and the film, and they'll both be talked about and shown this Friday night at the Public Museum of Milwaukee.
So you kind of talked about the way the film was made and how, I mean, I've watched pieces of it and it's very interesting. It's not just like looking at the story and having actors play the story, but like you said, it's this Q&A and you play yourself and are just kind of this presence, omnipresent figure. Um, what what went into like that decision? Why was it not a traditional film? And did you make that decision or how do you feel about all that?
It's not the film I would have made, but I think Anders Søstergaard, the Danish filmmaker, realized his vision just brilliantly. The focus is on Bruno Ganz as my father. It's his story, and I think Anders didn't want to dilute that at all by having other real people on screen. We do see a lot of historic footage. We see Goebbels speaking, we see Hitler speaking, we see the destruction of Kristallnacht, but the only living, walking, and talking figure is my father. And it's really eerie to see, from my perspective, how Bruno Ganz realized the character of my father. He didn't know him at all. When I met Bruno Ganz, I expected that he would take me aside and say, "Now, look, tell me everything you can recall about your father, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he lit up his pipe." But he wanted none of that. He created his own vision of my father based on the script and his own brilliance as an actor, and it's positively spooky seeing him on on the screen because his depiction of my father is just dead on.
Wow. That is insane. And he never, I mean, obviously never met him or anything too.
Right,
That's
right,
crazy.
right.
Wow. Um, I know in the film, your dad, Bruno Gans, who plays him, kind of talks a lot about his own relationship with being Jewish and how he never really felt like very connected to it. He felt more German than Jewish. It was kind of a very separate thing. And I know that you've even said in other interviews you've done, you kind of grew up separate from that whole part of yourself too. So how has working on this story affected your own identity?
It's deepened it considerably. And my father would say if the topic came up at all, he referred to us as, in his words, so-called Jews. He, I think he suffered greatly. I mean, he lost his parents, his younger brother, his sister, his aunt to the Holocaust. And I think it was just too painful to think of himself as a victim. And so he never embraced his Jewishness. In fact, there's a moment in the film which completely echoes life as it was. I discovered doing research in the archives of the city of Oldenburg, where my father grew up. There was in the synagogue there was a record of his celebrating his bar mitzvah when he turned 13 in 1926. And I told him about this. I was in Oldenburg and I immediately called him up. He was in the States. I was in Germany, and I said, "Dad, I found your the um, found proof of your bar mitzvah. And he said, I don't remember any of that. I said, what? You forgot your own bar mitzvah? That's not possible. And he said, well, they said I was bar mitzvah, but I don't remember it. So I think he was just putting all that aside from himself and deciding if Adolf Hitler decided that he was a Jew, he would reject that. Um, and that's the atmosphere in which I grew up. But learning what happened to my family, going back several generations, there is a little town an hour or so away from Oldenburg called Sachsenhagen, and there's a little Jewish cemetery. And my father's grandfather and great grandfather are are buried there, and it was quite, as you might imagine, quite an emotional um, meeting up with my relatives in that way. So I am so much more aware of myself as a Jew than I was before this whole project began.
It's interesting how, I mean, doing research into this project, I'm Armenian, so I saw a lot of similarities from stories from my family's history.
Yes,
And I mean, that first generation doesn't want to talk about anything that happened because it's so painful. But then after that, there's this like renewed sense of pride. And I don't know, there's something special that about that too. So
exactly, exactly.
yeah. Um, I mean, now we're going to talk about music, which is such a central part of this story. So both of your parents were musicians, and you are not like a professional musician, but you work very closely with music. So how do you think your parents' relationship with music has impacted the path you took?
Well, in the first chapter of my first book, I refer to what's the phrase is my chosen profession, and I said maybe my profession chose me. I think it's no accident that I've worked in music, in the classical music realm. Um, my mother was played when I was born in St. Louis. My mother played with the St. Louis Symphony for 21 years, and she had a string quartet made up of members of the orchestra, and they would often rehearse at my house. And and I recall being put to bed, and then hearing down the hall Beethoven quartets, Schubert quartets, the Ravel quartet. It was quite a way to be introduced to this timeless music. And as I say, maybe my chosen profession chose me.
So I had, when I was watching these movies, there were a couple of ideas that have been floating around in this day and age that I feel like the themes connect with what was happening back then. Maybe, I mean, obviously not to that extreme degree, but one of those ideas was joy as a form of resistance. And I know that music and theater and all the arts are very vital to us as a society. How do you think that that idea of joy as resistance kind of relates to the Kulturbund?
The Kulturbund is a very what's the phrase I want to use? It is a ambiguous organization. I mean, it's very much um, as I said earlier, to perform with the Kulturbund, to be an actor or a flutist or a dancer or to work the box office or to clean the lavatories, to do any of those things, you had to be a Jew. To attend performances, you had to be a Jew. It was very much an isolated, set aside um, organization with very, very high artistic standards. And it was a refuge for many, many artists. One of the former Kulturbund members I interviewed said that we really kind of put something over on the Nazis. What they didn't understand was that an actor lives to act, a musician lives to play his instrument, and we remained hopeful and alive because we were able to express ourselves artistically. Other people I interviewed for the book look back on their time with the Kulturbund with anger, saying the whole thing was a ruse. We were figures on the Nazi chessboard. The whole thing was a lie from beginning to end. We were used as propaganda figures. And both of those points of view are true. Um, but it did give people like my parents and people like Gene Drucker's father um, a way out. I mean, they were able to survive as useful members of the Nazi propaganda machine until they were able to find passage on a ship to leave Portugal in early June of 1941. Um, the joy you mentioned was certainly there. My father recalled how um, during the waking hours, uh, his mind was um, concentrated for months and months on how to get out of Germany, how to find the money to pay the fees, and how to get your passport stamped, and all of those 1,001 things you had to do to emigrate from Germany. And he said that at night, while you were performing Mendelssohn or Mahler, you left all that stuff behind, and you would make, as he put it once, you make music in the evening and you think about getting out of town the next morning. Um, as you say, it's not a one-to-one relationship between what's going on today and what went on then. But yes, to the degree that artists express their inner joy or outer joy um, while resisting um, tyranny of any sort, I think there definitely is a comparison.
Yeah, preserving a sense of normalcy is so
Yes.
important too. I can't even imagine. But the other idea that I was percolating in my mind while doing all this research was the idea that art is inherently political, which some people, that's like their bread and butter. They really believe that. And I mean, you've kind of touched on the fact that this was, in some sense, like a Nazi propaganda project, but then in another sense, it's an expression of Jewish art, and how it can be both of those things at once. So does that idea of art being inherently political, do you think that resonates with this idea of the Kulturbund?
Well, it's um, it's pretty amazing what they managed to do with very few resources. Again, they were supported by the Nazis because the Nazis saw it as a propaganda tool of theirs. But they also did some pretty audacious things. Uh, in February of 1941, when the Kulturbund was almost falling apart, by then, as many Jewish artists of the Kulturbund as possible were emigrating from Germany. And Kurt Singer, the artistic director of the Kulturbund, who was just a fascinating figure, tried to keep his charges in Germany. I mean, he would say, "Look, we're going to be doing uh, La Traviata next season, and I want you to play Violetta. We're going to be doing these amazing projects." Um, and he tried to keep as many artists from leaving as possible. In some instances, he condemned them to their deaths, though he obviously didn't intend that. They didn't know what was coming, but they stayed because he was such a, a presence, such a figure. In February of 1941, when more and more Jews were leaving the Kulturbund for safety around the world, which basically was restricted to New York City and Shanghai, the Kulturbund in Berlin performed Gustav Mahler's Resurrection Symphony, an immense piece that requires a huge orchestra, a huge chorus, soloists, the kitchen sink. It's just an amazing, amazing piece of music. And by this time, they the full orchestra wasn't there. They left. So Kurt Singer and his minions went around to nightclubs and jazz places and any place there might be a musician who knew how to read music, and they got in jazz trumpeters and stand-up bass players and this, all these people who had one goal in mind was to perform this amazing symphony by Gustav Mahler. And the hope and the joy that was part of that is sort of immeasurable. And whether you call it politics or uh, the need for the human animal to express itself, it was just an astounding feat um, given the circumstances at the time. I just, I, I just really love the memory, the what these artists managed to accomplish is just so worthy of love and respect.
I'm not very well versed in classical music, but I looked through some of the pieces that you sent that you recommended we play on air, and um, I think it was Finlandia. That was the final piece they played in their final concert, and I'm like, oh my God, knowing that context and just hearing, I can't even imagine what that would be like to be in that room with just hearing that. So
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty amazing.
yeah, it's awful that such ugliness is attached to it, but yeah.
Well, I think of the great singer-songwriter Phil Oakes, who said, in an ugly time, the best protest is beauty," and that's what they did.
Yeah. Um, Moving on to maybe something a little bit more upbeat, something a little happier.
Oh,
Um,
let's remain here in sackcloth and ashes for as long as we can.
do you have any future ventures or future projects coming up? I think I've heard you talk about a potential play about your aunt and her story.
Well, I'm afraid there's nothing to report
Okay.
on that
I
front.
got my
I
hopes
have
up.
I have written. Well, my first book was about my mother and father, basically, and my second book was about my father's father and younger brother, my grandfather and uncle, who attempted to escape Germany in the spring of 1939, but unfortunately they had the ill luck to book passage on the ill-fated Jewish refugee ship known as the St. Louis, and they were turned away from Cuba, where they thought they had bought tickets to, turned away from the US, turned away from Canada, and the ship then sailed back to Europe. And the passengers on board the St. Louis were allowed to disembark in either England, France, Belgium, or Holland. My grandfather and uncle disembarked in in France, but then shortly thereafter, the Second World War began on September 1st of 1939, and my grandfather and uncle were sent from one camp to another over the next 3 years until being sent to Auschwitz, where they were murdered in 1942. So I wrote about them, and some readers I've encountered have said, "What about the women members of your family? What about your grandmother, your aunt Ava?" And they also met a brutal end. They were shot in the back of the head in a forest outside Riga, Latvia. And I want to tell their story, but I haven't yet figured out what what medium I would use. And I've never written for the stage, but a friend of mine suggested maybe you could turn this into an intimate play with these two women. Um, but as I say, nothing to report at the moment. But if anything happens, I'll be sure to let you know.
Well, thank you. Those are all the questions I have for you. If you have anything else you'd like to add, here's your final chance.
Well, I really invite the folks of Greater Milwaukee and people who listen to Wisconsin Public Radio to make it down to the Public Museum of Milwaukee over there on Wells Street um, for an evening with me and Gene Drucker, the one of the founding violinists of the Emerson String Quartet. He's a novelist. We'll be talking about how his books reflect his dealing with the Holocaust, and we'll see the film Winter Journey with Bruno Ganz, and I think it will be a powerful evening, and I hope that some of your listeners will be able to make it down there on Friday night.
Well, thank you so much for joining me and letting me ask you all these questions. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Eva. It's been a great pleasure of mine as well.